Hello all, welcome to my video cast. If you could recall, while discussing Thomas Metcalfe's Liberalism and Empire, we have noted that James Mill and his son John Stuart Mill had been the catalysts for the liberal dispensation in India. In this video lecture, I shall discuss the idea of democratic representation by John Stuart Mill. I have divided the lecture into three parts. In the first part, we shall try and achieve some clarity on the concept of representation. In part 2, we will briefly discuss James Mill's idea of government. Understanding James Mill's idea of government is important because John Stuart Mill tried to build his arguments on representative government by drawing from his father's ideas that are majorly found in an essay on government. In the third part of the lecture, we shall examine John Stuart Mill's ideas and arguments on representative government. In developing my lecture, in addition to depending upon John Stuart Mill's original work, Considerations on Representative Government, I have drawn the ideas majorly from the article Two Concepts of Democratic Representation, James and John Stuart Mill by Richard Cross, and an essay on political representation in Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. John Stuart Mill was the most influential English philosopher of the 19th century. He was a naturalist, a utilitarian and a liberal. His work explores the consequences of a thoroughgoing empiricist outlook. In doing so, he sought to combine the best of 18th century Enlightenment thinking with newly emerging currents of 19th century Romantic and historical philosophy. His most important works include System of Logic, On Liberty, Utilitarianism, and an examination of Sir William Hamilton's philosophy, and of course Considerations on a Representative Government. Now let's begin by understanding the idea of representation. Hannah Pitkin, who has provided one of the most straightforward and comprehensive definitions on representation, notes that to represent is simply to make present again. On this definition, political representation is the activity of making citizens' voices, opinions and perspectives present in public policy making process. Political representation occurs when political actors speak, advocate, symbolize and act on the behalf of others in the political arena. In short, political representation is a kind of political assistance. From this, we can say that the concept of representation etymologically implies making present in some sense of something which is nevertheless present, literally or in fact, representation. The substantive activity of political representation reflects this etymological ambiguity. On the one hand, the representative must act independently. His action must involve discretion and judgment. He be the one who acts. Therefore, the represented is truly not present. On the other hand, the represented or the people who are represented must also be conceived capable of independent action and judgment, not merely taken care of. The represented is present in some sense. Thus, the activity of representation would seem to consist of the interest of the represented in a context in which the represented are conceived as capable of action and judgment, but in a way that they do not object to what is done in their name. Representation conceived in this sense is often presented simply and schematically as an effort to mediate between a democratic principle of mass participation and an aristocratic principle of elite competence. The precise content of the concept will vary with the weight or priority that is attached to these competing principles. Theories that attach priorities to the values of elite competence tend to incline towards some form of a trustee conception, in which the representative must act upon his or her own independent judgment of the public good irrespective of the expressed wishes of the constituents. Those that attach priority to the values of mass participation tend to incline towards some form of a delegate or mandate conception. In this, the representative must, wherever possible, reflect the wishes of the constituents. Following these categories, it is possible to distinguish among three broad orientations within democratic theory. Radical theories of participatory democracy, inclining to a delegate or mandate concept of representation. Conservative theories of elite democracy, inclining to a trustee conception. And liberal theories of representative democracy, which seek a more balanced reconciliation of elite competence and mass participation. The liberal theories embrace representation as a desirable means of promoting leadership, yet at the same time seek to preserve effective political equality and popular sovereignty. Now, let's move on to James Mill's idea of government. James Mill, who wrote an essay on government, theorized that government is exclusively a means to the end of happiness, which exists to the degree that pleasure are great and pains are small. Because resources are scarce, government is necessary to ensure that distribution of the scanty materials of happiness which will maximize aggregate satisfaction. This maximization requires maximum production of the objects of desire, which is achieved by assuring to every man the greatest possible quantity of the fruits of his own labor. The only purpose of government then is to secure every man's product from the force and fraud of other men. In other words, James Mill emphasizes the protective functions of government to the entire exclusion of its educative functions. Government exists not merely because resources are scarce, but also because men are radically selfish. Each man seeks and necessarily seeks his own greatest happiness. As a means to this end, all men desire power after power. Government is necessary to control this obscene impulse. Men must be protected not merely from each other, but from those who protect them as well. Indeed, this is the political problem. All the difficult questions of government relate to the means of restraining those in whose hands are lodged the powers necessary for the protection of all from making a bad use of it. Given the ubiquity of human selfishness in politics, there is only one way to achieve the end of government. We can protect against the abuse of power only if we ensure an identity of interests between those who rule and those who are ruled. That is to say, there should be commonality of interests or shared interests between the rulers and the ruled or the people. This identity is lacking in monarchical and aristocratic regimes, in the sense the ultimate aim of these two regimes is to acquire political power and keep in their hands. During that process, either a king or aristocrats are least bothered about the general public. Therefore, in both these regimes, the very purpose of the government is defeated. But democracy, James Mill argues, best fulfills the sole purpose of government, to maximize utility by protecting the security of tangible, divisible goods. Unlike monarchy and aristocracy, it can ensure an identity of interests between governors and governed. Representative democracy further reduces the bare minimum, the cost of participation required to enjoy the benefits of non-sinister government. Now, let me summarize James Mill's idea of government. At the heart of James Mill's idea of government is the idea of happiness. For Mill, pursuit of happiness seems to be the ultimate goal of human beings. But the resources that facilitate happiness are limited. In such a context of limited resources, if you leave human beings on their own in their pursuit of happiness, what results is the Hobbesian picture of state of nature, where everyone fighting against each other. Therefore, we require government to distribute the meager resources among all the people so as to maximize aggregate satisfaction. Then the question that arises at this junction is, what kind of government? James Mill rejects both the monarchical and aristocratic forms of government, as there won't be commonality of interest between the rulers and the ruled. However, democracy ensures an identity of interest between the governors and governed. Now, having discussed James Mill's idea of government, let's move on to discuss John Stuart Mill's idea of representative government. At the surface, it's important to note that J.S. Mill's ideas on representative government did not appear in one go or emerge suddenly in a particular point of time. In fact, they developed over a period of time. Broadly, one could recognize two stages in that development. And consideration of two distinct stages in the development of John Stuart Mill's concept of representation will permit us to understand the evolution of his political ideal. As he put it, I quote, from pure democracy as commonly understood by its partisans to the modified form of it, which is set forth in consideration on representative government. End of the quote. Therefore, let's examine those two stages. During the 1830s, at the height of his conservative reaction against Benthamite orthodoxy, Mill's primary concern was that the preservation of elite competence against the egalitarian tide of mass democracy. He came to criticize pure democracy as commonly understood by its partisans on two major grounds: ignorance and incapacity, and the political and social tyranny of the majority. And as a corrective to the potential for majority incompetence and injustice inherent in mass participation models of representative democracy, he sought to preserve and, if possible, enhance the intellectual authority in social and political life. It is useful to note here that during the early 1830s, Mill advocated the direction of social and political life by a unified moral and intellectual, which he called a spiritual power. Mill, in a series of essays on the spirit of the age, which was written in 1831, distinguished between transitional periods involving intellectual and moral anarchy and social and political disintegration, and natural periods in which a fully competent spiritual power or elite wields sovereign power. In Mill's conception, as it was then articulated, legitimate authority in a natural state of society depends not merely upon the moral and intellectual unity of the few, but also upon the deference or respect of the less competent many to this rational elite. Speaking of his frame of mind during these years, Mill wrote, I quote, it's an extensive quote, I no longer believe that the fate of mankind depended on the possibility of making all of them competent judges of questions of government and legislations. From this time, my hopes of improvement rested less on the reason of the multitude than on the possibility of effective such an improvement in the methods of political and social philosophy, as should enable all thinking and instructed persons who have no sinister interest to be so nearly of one mind on these subjects as to carry the multitude with them by their united authority. End of the quote. The younger Mill advocated a society in which the people, that is the uninstructed, he is distinguishing between elite and the common masses. Elite as instructed people and the masses or the general people as uninstructed shall entertain the same feelings of deference and submission to the authority of the instructed in morals and politics. And while Mill insisted even at this time that rational authority can and should be based upon rationally informed acceptance, a theme which becomes still more prominent in his subsequent writings, he also insisted that mass deference, respect to elite authority is less a matter of reason than faith. He speaks of a spiritual power capable of commanding the faith of the majority, who must and do believe an authority. So here, calling elite or the instructed people as a spiritual power, the commoners should, should believe, like a God. People believe in God. So the same faith, he's asking the people to believe in the elite, because they are the people who have some knowledge. Mill's social and political vision in the earliest years of the 1830s then involved a nearly competent subordination of the claims of mass participation to those of wise and virtuous leadership by a competent elite. Soon thereafter, however, Mill emphasis shifted slightly and came to see a more balanced reconciliation of these competing claims as the central problem of politics. In 1835 he wrote, I quote, "The grand difficulty in politics will for a long time be how best to conciliate the two great elements on which good government depends. To combine the greatest amount of the advantage derived from the independent judgment of a specifically instructed few with the greatest degree of the security for rectitude of purpose derived from rendering those few responsible to the many." End of the quote. How then did Mill seek to reconcile his ideal of a natural state of society based upon wise and virtuous leadership by a competent elite with the politics of democracy? First and foremost, Mill sought a democratic solution to the incompetence and injustice of popular majorities in an adequate conception of the role of the representative. In the decades of the 1830s, when he first fully formulated his views on the subject, Mill gave expression to an extreme trustee theory of representation. While doing so, Mill explicitly attacked the mandate or delegate conception of the role of the representative, a role that was widely accepted in advanced circles of radical opinion at the time, rejecting most specifically the view that elected representatives should be bound by detailed pledges to their constituents. Mill argues if leadership is to be with the wisest and the best men in the nation, why set the smaller wisdom to instruct the greater? In this argument, I think Mill was suggesting that let the wisest take the decision and let the commoners or masses follow those decisions. In 1835, Mill reviewed Samuel Bailey's Rationale of Representation and Volume 1 of Tocqueville's Democracy in America. In these reviews, Mill systematically amplified his opposition to delegate or mandate representation. In both of these essays, Mill argues that the idea of a rational democracy is not that the people themselves exercise political judgment, either directly or through the agency of instructed delegates, but that they assign this responsibility to the wisest and most virtuous among themselves, who will then serve as independent trustee of the public interest. The many must exercise their judgment rather upon the character and talents of the persons whom they appoint to decide questions for them than upon the questions themselves. In other words, Mill is taking the people to leave the decisions about their lives to the elite or the persons with knowledge. What they should concern is about the character and talents of these elites and not the questions in the parliament. He also suggests that once the elites are elected, then they should be allowed to hold onto the office as long as they serve the interests of the people or do not pursue their selfish interests. In any case, for Mill, the longer duration is better since the elite can exercise their superior knowledge and judgment with the least possible control. In justification of this argument, Mill notes that government is a technical art. Therefore, it is essential that it be conducted by a select body, not by the people collectively. That political questions be not decided by an appeal, either direct or indirect, to the judgment or will of an uninstructed mass, whether of gentlemen or of clowns, but by the deliberately formed opinions of a comparatively few, specially educated for the task. From this, what is clear is that Mill's concept of trustee representation supports and will only support a highly aristocratic theory of elite democracy. The instructed class, a class of elites or people with superior knowledge, a class that Mill came to associate with rational authority, is desirable in order to promote not merely the protective purposes of government, his father's idea, but also its educative purposes. Hence, it is for Mill a matter of crucial importance that the National Assembly contain representatives of the educated classes, because, I quote, besides being an instrument of government, Parliament is a grand instrument of national education, having for one of its valuable offices to create and correct that public opinion whose mandates it is requires to obey. End of the quote. The dialect of vigorous political discussion and debate in a parliament representing every shade of interest and opinion, including elevated interest and opinion, is one of the foremost benefits of a free government. And the moral and educative influence of the instructed in this process would, Mill believes, be out of all proportion to their numbers. Mill's emphasis, beginning in the 1830s and continuing throughout his life, upon enhancing the rational authority of a competent minority or moral and intellectual elite, forms a central element of his social and political thought. Even in the early years of 1830s and still more pronouncedly thereafter, Mill hoped that the moral and intellectual authority which he favored would emerge from increased consensus among the members of his instructed minority and from the increased intelligence of the relatively less instructed majority. Consideration on a representative government enlists Mill's protective and educative criteria to advocate simultaneous institutional provisions for both elite competence and mass participation. In this view, we see that Mill emphasizing upon the mass participation more strongly than in the 1830s. And such stronger emphasis upon the protective and especially educative purposes of participation leads Mill to adopt a revised concept of representation. For Mill, a strong principle of mass participation is required because, first, to satisfy the perfect protective criteria, human beings are safe from evil at the hands of others only to the extent that they are self-protecting, and they achieve a high degree of success in their struggle with nature only to the extent that they are self-dependent. Both of these objectives, self-protection as well as self-dependence, Mill argues are more fully achieved under democratic government. Even without assuming that an exclusive ruling class will knowingly and deliberately sacrifice general to sinister interests, though it probably will, it can be asserted that in the absence of its natural defenders, the interests of the excluded is always in danger of being overlooked. Furthermore, only by the self-exertion of a people, only by their own hands, can any positive and durable improvement in the circumstances of life be worked out. Thus, for Mill's argument clearly resembles the protective, rational or representative, thus far, Mill's argument clearly resembles the protective rationale for representative democracy that underlies his father's essay on government. But if the evaluation of political institutions were to turn exclusively on the question of present good government and material self-interest, then it could be argued that a perfectly benevolent and efficient despotism, if feasible, would be the ideally best polity. For James Mill, democracy would be superfluous or unnecessary if angels or philosopher kings were to govern men. John Stuart Mill, by contrast, categorically rejects this one-dimensional view. The theory of enlightened despotism, he argues, leaves out of the idea of good government, which is precisely supposed to be its principal concern, namely the improvement of the people themselves. I quote Mill here: "One man of superhuman energy managing the entire affairs of a mentally passive people. Their passivity is implied in the very idea of absolute power. up by one man. The nation as a whole and every individual composing it are without any voices in their own destiny. They exercise no will in respect to their collective interests. What development can their thinking or their active facilities attain under it? End of the quote. So therefore, Mill has a second justification for mass participation in political and social life. Democracy is preferable to even the most benevolent despotism because it is educative. It both stimulates an active rather than passive character type and creates opportunities for mass participation, which by directing these active qualities into channels that develop the political intelligence and public spirit of citizens, work to improve the virtue and intelligence of the people themselves. On both protective and educative grounds, therefore, some form of representative democracy is for Mill the ideal best polity. Representative democracy not merely because this is the only feasible form outside the confines of a small town or city-state, but also because representation is a source of wise and virtuous leadership by a competent elite. In a representative democracy, the principal form of political activity is voting in elections. Hence, Mill argues every adult who is literate and self-supporting should, on both protective and educative grounds, have the right to vote. But voting for representative is not for Mill a sufficient condition of properly constituted popular government. I quote here, a political act to be done only once in a few years and for which nothing in the daily habits of the citizens has prepared him. To be free, a people must learn to participate on a direct and continuing basis. This participation requires a democratic constitution supported by democratic institutions in detail. End of the quote. It is to be ideally best polity, representative democracy in the nation state must be supplemented by a more participatory forms of political action. The crucial importance of subnational units of democratic participation, a theme that Mill derived from Tocqueville, becomes a central idea of his mature social and political thought. Local democracy is for Mill the chief instrument of popular political education. Without it, the mass of the population has very little opportunity beyond voting and political discussion to share in the conduct of common affairs. With it, many citizens have the chance of being elected to office and of performing by selection or rotation local executive or judicial functions. And since those in the higher ranks do not generally seek local office, political education is carried down to a much lower grade in society. Moreover, participatory democracy at the local level is for Mill in no way incompatible with the exemplary influence of the elevated few. Since national education is a primary objective of local self-government, it is important that every such body contain a portion of the very best minds of the locality. Their participation will infuse the less elevated with a portion of their own more enlarged ideas and higher and more enlightened purposes. It should be noted that the public self-education of the citizenry through local self-government does not mean that people should be left entirely to the imperfect lights. Since greater knowledge and cultivate are likely to reside with the central authorities, some measure of guidance and direction of local by national government can be justified on educational grounds. Therefore, in Mill's mature social and political thought, we are offered a theory of representative democracy that seeks to combine a strong commitment both to the value of elite competence, stressed so heavily by Mill in the decade of the 1830s, and to the value of mass participation. However, to argue that a consistent intention unites the disparate strains of a theory is not necessarily to suggest that the resulting synthesis is an altogether stable or successful one. As such, we should now ask whether the prima facie tension between the elite and participatory dimensions of Mill's theory has been altogether resolved. Can Mill's strong principles of both elite competence and mass participation be realized simultaneously, or would one overwhelm the other? Whereas a consistently radical theory of representative democracy would seek to maximize citizen participation and the control at both local and national levels of authority, Mill appears to have sought to reconcile a strong trustee concept of national representation with maximum mass participation in both national elections and local government. Yet, it is difficult to see how a concept of representation requiring the virtually complete abdication or abandonment of will and intelligence by the ordinary citizens is compatible with a theory of democracy stressing the beneficial, protective and especially educative consequences of maximum mass participation. A lack of congruence between elite and participatory institutions seem to threaten the coherence of Mill's attempted synthesis. I shall end here. If there are any questions, I am happy to take up in the classroom. Thank you.